Thanks very much, and thank you for having me. Happy to step in at late notice. It's the first time I've actually stood up on this very stage. I'm usually down there on the floor asking questions. Well, what a day, you know, what a couple of interesting days. I guess the naysayers about same-sex marriage were right. It really has led to moral decay. We just didn't think it would involve the Deputy Prime Minister. So certainly we'll give a... Usually, Malcolm Turnbull's off to America next week. Usually a trip to the States would give him a bit of respite, but given that he's going over there to meet a serial philanderer and Donald Trump, it should be... he certainly should have some interesting notes to compare and things like that. But look, obviously the situation with Barnaby Joyce, it's sort of occupied the attention for pretty much the last 10 days of the country, certainly the political media, as much as we like to sort of pretend that these sorts of stories are very mucky and dirty and we don't get down in the gutter about sort of journalism with this and things like that. It has sort of just snowballed, as we've seen, into like probably quite extraordinary circumstances. First of all, in question time yesterday, where we had the situation when the Prime Minister was saying that Matthias Cormann will be the acting Prime Minister for next week, having to go down that far in the batting order, quite unprecedented, I think, certainly in recent times. And it was a major shift in how the Prime Minister's relationship with Barnaby Joyce had been gone. Like earlier in the week, we saw him saying he still had confidence in him and things like that. I think as events transpired, it's shown that confidence has been very badly shaken, and the question definitely in the short term is, can that be rebuilt? Probably, given the press conference the Prime Minister did afterwards, arguably not. I mean, quite extraordinary, where the Prime Minister, his hands are obviously tied that he can't sack him because Barnaby is the National Party leader. That's a decision for the Nationals. But he as good as effectively told him to resign when he suggests, you know, consider your position. Barnaby, of course, is digging in. We hear it certainly seems to have maybe just got some of the Nationals back up about that. They don't like to being told what to do by the Liberal Party. How that gets resolved, who knows, really. I mean, we are in this sort of glorious period of uncertainty, I think, for the next few weeks at least, away from the hothouse atmosphere of Canberra. The Nationals will be hoping that perhaps a bit of clear air, chance to maybe take the temperature away from this issue, might allow Barnaby to survive. But really, I just can't see any way of how that relationship between PM and Deputy PM can be sort of navigated easily. Where that leaves the government, obviously a one-seat majority. It's sort of, the Nationals may have lost their moral authority, but the iron laws of arithmetic mean the government is still heavily dependent on the Nationals. They're still hostage to the Nationals on legislation and votes in Parliament and things like that. Whether that can be something that's managed, or whether the Nationals can sort of see the good sense in that maybe Barnaby should go for the sake of not only for himself, but for the party, for the government and for the coalition. It certainly will be something that will be interesting to see how that gets resolved. I mean, really, I'm not a particular oracle on this. I just think it is really in a really great period of flux. I think there's a certain sense that Barnaby will be finished off if there is another sort of revelation that comes out. But if, as I said, if they can get away and try and get maybe a few days, let cooler heads prevail, that may be enough to save his job for the time being, but we'll see. More broadly, I think with the government, we saw them have a good end to 2017, ironically enough, with the by-election with Barnaby Joyce in New England, where they got a thumping result. They held on to Bennelong. The Prime Minister achieved the passage of the resolution of the same-sex marriage issue. The government had a bit of momentum. It looked like that had carried into the beginning of the year. There was the reports we might have seen, the little murmurings about the doubts that creep in from time to time about Bill Shorten and things like that, the sort of the personal questions about whether he can lead them to victory, given that he's standing in the opinion polls is quite low. So there was that sort of, we started to see that little dynamic emerge. Even, you know, probably a fortnight ago, we were probably starting to think collectively among the press gallery that the story was probably going to be shifting to Labor and what we see there, but obviously the Barnaby Joyce things have sort of blown that away. So we have this sort of situation where the Prime Minister is probably looking as secure as he has been for some time, but outside events have sort of taken that away from him. Nonetheless, I think he probably will hang on for the time being, even though the polls still aren't very good for the government. I think he does remain the government's best asset. I think it'll be very difficult for them to move on. I think one thing we have seen from the same-sex marriage vote is that I think Tony Abbott's position within the Liberal Party has been a bit diminished. I mean, he was going to go out and take a prominent role in the campaign. I mean, this is a guy who couldn't even convince voters in his own electorate that same-sex marriage was a wrong thing, let alone the country. So I think we've seen his role very much fading. You know, he'll obviously be there, but I think this is probably the best the Prime Minister's going to have in terms of governing. Where we go looking for the year ahead, there's obviously a bit of talk about election speculation and things like that. We've already started to see the government and the opposition lay out the battleground, I guess, in the broader spectrum of cost of living. I think you can lump a lot of these issues that are running around sort of in the economic debate under this category at the moment. You know, things like energy policy, energy prices and stuff like that. There's obviously a concern for both industry as well as households. Households probably will get the greater focus, obviously because households vote, whereas companies don't. So we will see a bit of that. We're seeing the government sort of pushing, obviously, the tax cut campaign, both in terms of company tax and income tax. There'll be income tax cuts announced in the budget, no doubt. That will allow the government to sort of give a message to the Australian people about putting more money in their pockets. That will help in the terms of the political narrative for them around this idea of we're on your side, we can help you out, and we sort of understand that you're doing it tough and things like that. That's their sort of pitch to the Australian public. On the Labor side, we've seen Bill Shorten go talking heavily on wages. Wages growth has obviously been very low for a long time. He's flagged a more interventionist part in the industrial relations system to grow wages. Some of that will involve sort of union empowerment, no doubt, and as we've seen. And we're really starting to see probably a real sort of good split, ideological split in terms of both the government and opposition. I mean, we always complain about how elections are about nothing. You know, we just hear spin and crap and all this sort of stuff. Well, I think what we really will see whenever the election is held, a real contest of ideas of between a Labor Party, which is moving further and further to the left, which is becoming, led by a leader who is particularly in hock to the unions, putting a left-wing populist slant on things of intervention, of attacking business, trying to sort of push that pitch against a government which is sort of saying, offering, I guess, like a orthodox sort of view of free market economics and smaller government in the sense of offering tax cuts for both companies and individuals. It certainly seems it's an easier argument for the Labor Party to run. You know, we're getting into, I guess, effectively the politics of grievance when we talk about this cost of living issue, where people feel that they're being hard done by and things like that. We're also seeing it too with things like with the Labor Party and how they're approaching private health insurance. Bill Shorten, a couple of weeks ago, as we saw, launched quite a big attack on the private health insurance industry. promising to sort of cap their premium rises at 2%. I mean, health inflation generally runs around 5-6%. I think it has come down a little bit though, but I mean, it's quite extraordinary to have something, an opposition leader reinsert himself so solidly, and not just in saying we'll bring private health insurance premiums down, but to sort of put an actual figure to it. Quite an interesting sort of step, but I think we'll see some more of those sorts of things around there. I'm talking about more regulation and things like that from the Labor Party perspective. And that feeds into, again, this sort of climate of populism that we've had, and not just in Australia, but around the world, you know, with things like Trump and Brexit and stuff like that. It's certainly not going to go away. Labor sort of certainly seems to think it's onto a winning edge about that. And I think when you look around, when you talk to a lot of people, we all seem to have, as my mother would say, a lot of shit on our liver about different things, you know. It is a very much a grievance sort of sense around there, even though the government does have sort of, on the macro level, a very good sort of economic narrative to tell, you know, with things like unemployment, a very benign sort of situation with inflation and things like that. So a lot of, it's very hard to try and get this picture across from the government's point of view that things aren't as bad as people feel. How Malcolm Turnbull can do that, I think that will be the key to where he can, if there is the government is to recover, is to sort of try and give this sense of things are good again and stuff like that. Maybe, as John Howard once said, you know, relaxed and comfortable. It's a good way to be. I mean, people derided him for that, but it's probably a good way where you want voters to be. You don't want them to sort of be angry, waiting to kick you when you get the chance and things like that. And if he can turn around and get people feeling that way, that will, I think, sort of mitigate this issue around populism. You know, if people think that government is on their side and not against them, it's making their life maybe not easier, but not making it any harder. I think that will be a real challenge there. So we'll look to see that in the budget. The government's obviously the last couple of years have sort of tried to neutralise things around school and health funding and things like that. As I said, with the income tax, it'll be more about trying to help people get ahead there. As John was saying, I do a bit of foreign affairs and things like that as well. I think there's a really sort of fascinating dynamic there, which will sort of continue to influence our politics there, and that's around China. We saw at the end of last year, obviously, all the debate around foreign interference that's left the Chinese feeling very aggrieved. Interesting though, I mean, we've had the government sort of not send the occasional sort of mixed signals on that at times, like we've had the government take a very hard line, like the Prime Minister take a very hard line on it, talking about the threat of foreign interference and things like that. And Julie Bishop at times sort of had to walk it back. We saw that most recently earlier this year around this debate around Chinese foreign aid in the Pacific and stuff like that. Trying to manage that dynamic is very hard, and I think we'll see how that plays out. It's probably the great dilemma for the next 5-10 years. So I think I've been given the wind up.